Okay, again, starting without some of our students, but we're going to get started anyway. Well, let me see here. Let me, um, just a second. I need it. Uh, Today's discussion is not, some of you may not find it very interesting. It is more directly oriented towards business. And so those of you who never envision yourselves as being business managers or business executives may not have a great interest in this, but it is. We've talked about Clayton Christensen in the past, and he is, as I've mentioned, considered the best business mind in the world right now. And even if you don't think you will be interested in business now, you never know when things might change as you get older and you have a good idea. And it's just, to me, it's fascinating to listen to and to understand the thinking of great people, even if I can't imagine myself doing what they suggest to do. I like to see how their minds think, and that challenges my mind to think similarly. And so I entitled this. Actually, I started this title. I changed it when I expanded this discussion and did a webinar at a university in India from here over the internet using Zoom and so forth. And but I left this title on because I think it does maybe challenge us a little bit. You know, how startups succeed and how you can be part of the next big deal, because we can be. Especially if you implement all the things we've talked about. For example, in my discussion on how you can sometimes start at the bottom and just prove that you can be dependable and then you work your way up. If you find out about a startup that is just kind of getting going, it is definitely possible to do exactly that, to be the dependable person and work for nothing for a while. If you can imagine yourself, for example, being one of Jack Ma's friends, and he gathers his 12 people or so, whatever, in his room and gives them the rah-rah talk, and they stick with him. And so I don't, I know I know that Jack Ma's worth many billions of dollars, but I suspect that the people in that room, those that saw him through and were dependable, are probably also worth $1 billion. Maybe not worth as much as Jack, but they're worth a bunch. And there have been lots of these garage startups. You're talking about Apple and Microsoft and many others. You don't know when your opportunity might come along, and maybe your only investment is your time and work ethic in order to get involved in something like that. So anyway, I think it's worth, again, it's worth understanding the mind of a person, seen as the smartest guy in the room. And it's also good to understand how we can perhaps be part of the next big deal. Today we're going to I'm not going to teach anything out of the college success book. So I anticipate having time to listen to a number, perhaps the top 3 videos here, which are all from Clayton Christensen and help us to understand his thinking directly from the way he presents. The bottom 2 actually end up, if you watch the whole thing, you'd be watching 2 hours. But if you notice, it says watch at least half. So 1/2 would be 1 hour. If you really find yourself interested in what he's talking about, though, like I said, the one down here that's 80 minutes is his discussion with Google executives. And that's when I mentioned that the latter part of the video to me is one of the most interesting parts, because here's all these smart people asking him questions. And so they're trying to challenge his thinking, well, how about this and how about that? And so listening to his response to those questions is interesting to me. The discussion between Christensen and Andreessen. Andreessen was one of the smartest guys in the room, 20 years ago. He was, 25 years ago, especially. He had the first really big, popular web browser called Netscape, and that was actually I still use it. Um, I don't know exactly how he did it legally, but it still exists as a free web browser and web creation software now called SeaMonkey. And what I liked about it in the early years was that that was well, at very first when I started first making web pages, it was with purely the HTML coding itself. But then along came Netscape, and it had a built-in what you see is what you get um, uh, internet creation software, and that's what's still available. So I still use it. Once I rediscovered it, I decided that was one of the better things I still had to create web pages. I have to admit I haven't advanced to HTML5 and with the latest software, but most of what I do doesn't require it. And so I still like the old what now is called SeaMonkey that Andreessen created 25 years ago. And anyway, he made quite a bit of money off that. He took that to the stock exchange, went public with that, and then later he started another one. I'm not as familiar with his second venture, but he went public with a second a second company, and so he ended up with quite a bit of money. And so he's a venture capitalist based in Silicon Valley, and he and his partners invest in a lot of different startups in the Silicon Valley. So he has an interesting perspective, and so this discussion between Andreessen and Christensen is very interesting. In fact, he mentions. Let me just give you a preview of a little bit of that discussion, which we're not going to watch in class. But the interviewer that's interviewing, kind of facilitating this discussion between the two, asked Andreessen, what his thinking is of Christensen's disruptive innovation. He basically says it was like suddenly realizing, the difference between, maybe, just a lower type math, maybe algebra, and suddenly realizing the world of calculus. It was just like seeing the whole world in a different light. And one of the things, for example, he said, we always thought that the best run companies were the most unlikely to be overcome by a startup. He said, now actually we find out just the opposite. That under the disruptive innovation, we realize that to some degree, the best run companies are the most susceptible because they're the ones that have all the smart guys who learned off from the professors who really didn't know what they were talking about. um, Christensen himself hates some of the stuff that finance professors teach, for example. He says it's like a religion. They build up these ratios and these methods of analyzing investments and stuff, and it's like a religion, and you have to go by their calculations, and those calculations have destroyed companies because they do not calculate in the importance of disruptive innovation. And we'll talk about that a little bit today in class, but they go through some of that. This discussion between Christensen and Andreessen is to me quite interesting. In fact, it even reveals to me what happened when Donald Trump became president and why the United States economy suddenly went like that. And that basically, a couple of things he mentioned, I may have mentioned this in class, I don't know, but one thing, in fact, I'm sure I did mention it recently, but just to reiterate, this came up in this discussion, was that at the time, this discussion was in 2016, in other words, about 6 months before the election. And as soon as President Trump became president, suddenly the stock market went zooming. The employment went zooming, everything started going. And once you understand his perspective, once you understand the theories of Dr. Christensen, you can understand exactly what happened. But anyway, the couple of facts that help enlighten me as to what happened, because it didn't make a lot of sense in a way, in that it took off before Trump could do anything. He didn't actually do anything, and suddenly it took off. And you say, wait a second, he didn't do anything. So, how can Obama not take credit for it? Except it happened exactly the day he was not inaugurated. He comes along, and the day he's inaugurated, everything goes, wow. Wait a second, what happened here? He didn't actually incorporate, he didn't actually do anything yet. And yet the stock market and employment and everything took off the same month he was inaugurated. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But what they said in this discussion does help it make sense. That people under Obama were so scared of investing, they thought that we were going to go collapse again into another recession. There was active discussion about a new recession, and we really hadn't, it was the slowest recuperation from a recession in history. And so in those 8 years of Obama, it wasn't a recession, but it didn't recover either. It was just kind of going along. A lot of people were working part-time. A lot of people had just left the job market. So that's one of the things we see under Trump is suddenly 6 million people or something like that who had left the job market. They said, we're not even going to look for a job anymore. They have come back into the job market, 6 million people in America. And so that's one of the telltale signs that it wasn't Obama that did this, is that suddenly something happened, that suddenly a bunch of new investment came into the market, new employment took place, and it was attractive enough that people that had basically retired and said, we quit, there's nothing to do here that's worth our doing, 6 million people have come back to work. And so we have the highest participation rate currently in our job market in decades, which was down at one of the lowest participation rates under Obama. So that's one of those things you look at and say, wait a second, something dramatic happened here. So anyway, during this discussion, one of the things that Andreessen points out is that under Obama, the corporations were afraid to make investments. And so they were paying out anything they could pay out, they were paying out to their stockholders. And so the Fortune 500 companies were paying out $1 trillion a year, just giving it back to their stockholders. They were not going to invest that into anything risky. And disruptive innovation, by definition, is risky. And so none of them were or at least not none of them is too strong a word, but many of the Fortune 500 companies were saying, we're just standing back. We're just going to survive here, and we're going to give this money back to the stockholders. And so they trust us, they like us, and at some point we'll start investing again into our company. But they were not investing significantly into their own companies. And then he also mentions that that at that time, I believe it was $6 trillion was invested into negative yield bonds, which if you don't understand what that means, it basically means you're paying for somebody to take your money from you. They're bonds that will not give you any profit whatsoever. But they're good bonds. They're bonds by the American government, stuff like that. So you trust that you'll get your money back, but you'll do it at a cost. You will make no profit from it. You're just giving them your money and saying, someday give it back to me. And you're paying for that service. And so $6 trillion was invested into negative yield bonds. If you can imagine, just kind of crazy. But they didn't trust the economy. And so you had basically $6 trillion there available that could at any time when people felt like they trusted the economy, they could pull that out and invest it. And that's exactly what happened when Donald Trump was elected and was inaugurated. Is that finally the investors said, okay, this guy walks the talk, he talks the talk and walks the walk. He's a businessman. Now it's time to pull our money out of the negative yield bonds and go to work with it. And so it happened like that. As soon as he was inaugurated, everything changed. Now, he did follow up with a tax break, with doing away with government regulations, with opening up the spigot so that they could more easily invest in energy. And so during his time, America has finally, after decades, become not an energy exporter instead of a energy importer, and all sorts of stuff that he did that have happened under his watch. But it's interesting to look at what happened through, and I've never seen anybody else, no other journalist ever iterate what I have, which is look at this through Christensen's eyes, and you'll understand. You'll understand exactly what happened here, because otherwise it makes no sense. And otherwise you could believe Obama when he keeps saying, "I did it, I did it, I did it." No, you didn't do it. It all happened as soon as you got out of there, because nobody trusted you. Nobody trusted your economy. You're right, though, that everything was set up for Trump. In a sense, you were right. There was that $6 trillion just waiting for Trump to come along. There was that $1 trillion that was being given out to stockholders, just waiting for Trump to come along. But it wasn't going to come out as long as you were in the White House, Obama. It wasn't going to come out because nobody trusted you to be business friendly. You were anti-business. And so all the investors were just waiting for you to leave. And so, yeah, in that sense, you set it up. Obama, you're right. You set it up for Trump to immediately be successful, because all that money was just stockpiled there in negative yield bonds and so forth, just waiting for you to leave. And so, yeah, you set it up for Trump. Good job. And so it's interesting to see the world through his eyes. There's other things he's noted too, that in his, not in that video, but another video, I'm not sure if it's one that's assigned or not, but one of his students was Japanese, and he contacted him and said, "Hey, Japan is dead. We're goners." And at the time he said it, Japan had the second biggest economy in the world. He said, "What are you talking about? It can't be that bad." And I may have talked about this before too, but basically, after Christensen looked at it, he said, "You're right, it's dead. Japan has no hope." And the reason why Japan has no hope is because it has an aging economy. Well, first off, it begins with some cycles that he sees, and I know I've mentioned this before, but some cycles that he's seen in the economies of different countries. Is that when a country is striving to become, one of the top ones in the world, like Japan was struggling to do, starting back in the 1950s and 1960s after the war, with some strong help from America, actually, they were struggling to become relevant again after the disaster of World War II. Actually, in the video, if you watched it already from Zig Ziglar, he talks about that, how Japan brought themselves up from the ashes of World War II. But during that period of time, lots of people in a country in that mode, lots of people want to be scientists and engineers and so forth. They go into those fields, and then as soon as their families get rich, the next generation or the next or two generations, they all want to go into social science and humanities. Nobody wants to go into the hard subjects anymore. Nobody wants to be a scientist. Nobody wants to be a technologist. Nobody wants to, So once an economy becomes wealthy and the families in that economy, the family in that society become wealthy, they don't want to be engineers and stuff anymore. That's too hard. And so they start bailing out. And that's one thing he saw in Japan was that this next generation, there's not another generation of engineers coming up. I mean, there's engineers, but not nearly as many as there were when they were becoming the second greatest economy in the world. And so you have their children bailing out of the hard subjects. Meanwhile, at the same time, you have this problem of demographics. Lots of countries have the problem of demographics of their of their too many people retiring and not enough in the younger generation because of population control. Basically, the younger generation is not, there's not enough of the younger generation to replace the older generation. So you have the older generation of engineers and scientists and mathematicians all retiring, and you have this younger generation that didn't want to go into math and stuff. Plus, their numbers are fewer. So their numbers are fewer. They didn't want to go into math and the hard subjects anyway. And then the difference between the United States and Japan is Japan doesn't want immigration. And America brings in 1 million new people a year, and what Trump is now asking is we want to give priority to those in those areas that we need for our economy, which already Canada does that and Australia does that. Many countries do that, but under the Democrat control, they were basically doing lotteries and stuff. And Trump is saying that no, it doesn't. America first is his motto. We will bring in the scientists and the engineers and the mathematicians that we need, and then when we have extra room, we'll let other people come in that can, clean the toilets and stuff, whatever. The work, and he'll look at certain. There will be people under that scenario. There have to be people come work the farm. So there have to be people willing to work out under the sun. Otherwise, the farmers are going to go broke, and they're some of his strongest supporters are the farmers. So it won't just be smart people, but they'll look at the needs of the country under his plan, and under the Australian plan, and under the Canadian plan. That's what they do already. But America hasn't been doing that. It's been kind of like a lottery system. It literally had a lottery system, obviously, and he wants to do away with that. So that is why you can start looking at this globally and see, okay, which countries are coming up, which ones are breeding the best new engineers and mathematicians and scientists, and which ones are in the decline. That their next generation is getting lazy, and they don't want to study the hard stuff anymore. And so, his thinking as his discussion is, well, you can see Korea coming in right behind Japan now, taking over some of the car market and some of the other markets that Japan had a hold of. And he said China's coming in after them. And so you're seeing, one country after another go up and down, up and down. And the only way to prevent that too much is immigration. And so it's interesting that America is one of the few countries actually invites immigration. I mean, there's some discussion on who to allow in, but actually both just the nature of the way that America was created by people from all over the world coming and taking part in the American dream, we're not afraid of new people coming in. There's some exceptions. There are some people afraid of Muslims coming in, for example, because of 9/11. But by and large, even those people understand, they understand you can't be too prejudiced against immigrants. And so even if some of those who are a little bit leery of Muslim coming in and so forth, who would rather have Christians coming in, they're not getting their way. They probably never will, except to the extent that Trump has said, which Democrats get all over him for, as long as you can provide support, give us a way to what's the right word, to check on the background of people who want to immigrate, then they're welcome to come. But we have to be able to, there are some countries, and a lot of them happen to be Muslim, where they're in such disarray that they can't give any support to the U.S. government for them to check out their background to make sure they're not terrorists and stuff like that. And so while the Democrats have tried to make hay out of that, actually I had a discussion with the head of UNESCO in Central Asia while I was during the break, and he totally supported Trump. He said that's there's some of these countries, like I think one of them is Uzbekistan. I think it's Uzbekistan he was talking about. He said they're refusing to help the Trump administration to vet immigrants. And it said that whole bunch of them had joined ISIS and stuff, but so had people from Kazakhstan. but he's not. Kazakhstan is willing to help vet immigrants, and so they're allowed to come in. But the Uzbeks are not at this point because they're not willing, and either not willing or not able, whichever the case might be, of helping the U.S. vet people. But anyway, so that's, so you can start seeing as you start understanding how these things are going, you can understand some of the world events a little bit better, and the way the economies grow and fall and grow and fall. So, when I was I may have already told this story. If I did, I shouldn't have. Just screwed up today then. But it was interesting that in the 1910s, there was a guy named Otto Roeder, and this is from a talk on TED by Seth Godin, is the guy in the picture. He's not the inventor; he's the speaker. But he said back in the 1910s, Otto Roeder sold his jewelry store in America in order to fund his efforts to build the world's first bread slicing machine. But for 15 years, it was a total failure. So he invested everything he had into this bread slicer that would automatically slice bread, and nobody cared about sliced bread until about 15 years later, a company named Wonder Bread decided they wanted to slice all their bread. They were going to go into the market, and this was in the very middle of the Great Depression, the very worst time to start a new business in lots of perspectives. Actually, a lot of people say actually that's the best time, because you have a bunch of people, a bunch of companies that were doing more or less what people were doing under Obama. They're not investing. They're scared. And so while some companies are scared, other companies go into the market, and that's exactly during that time. For example, Ford was number one auto company going into the 1930s. By the time they left the 1930s, General Motors had overtaken them because General Motors was investing in new cars, new technology, new designs, and Ford was being conservative. And you can see that in a lot of different fields, in the different industries, that the 1930s saw some companies that were ahead go back, and some companies that were way down go up, depending on who invested and who didn't invest during that period of time. And so Wonder Bread was one of those companies that did decide to invest. And they decided to slice all of their bread, put it in a really bright package. It had balloons all over it, and they put some vitamins in it. And so it was more than just being sliced. It was also they figured out a marketing plan. They thought people would buy their bread if they put some vitamins in and so forth. And they did. Suddenly it took off, and within, I think it was within a year, something like that. So a very short period of time, maybe I say here, most of the bread in America was being sliced within a very short time. So even not just because they were buying for Wonder, but because everybody else realized how big they were growing, and so everybody decided to compete with them. They said, well, if it makes sense for Wonder Bread to do this, it makes sense for us to do it too. So suddenly, everybody in America was buying sliced bread in the middle of the Depression. Well, in Kazakhstan, 99% of the bread is still not sliced, which I find interesting, because then, after this talk by Gooden, that it's an interesting case study. Why not Kazakhstan? They still buy non-sliced bread. Nobody's ever there's been no Wonder Bread in Kazakhstan. There's been no company to go there and say, yeah, this is really cool stuff. We'll give you sliced bread. You don't have to worry about it yourself. We're going to put some vitamins in it. We're going to go hoopla, put some balloons in our package, whatever. Nobody's done that. And so there sits Kazakhstan, and everybody says, why would we want sliced bread? So it's interesting that something that hit America, 90 years ago has never gotten to Kazakhstan. Interesting insight. But more or less what we're talking about is the same thing. We're getting into Christensen territory. I was challenged when I traveled to India. I moved here in 2017, but just before that, a couple of months before that, I went to India to speak at the biggest private university there. And after I got done speaking, about how the world was going to change because of the digital age and so forth, particularly in my area of news and communications. One of the students challenged me and said, all of our newspapers in India are doing well. So why do you say they're going to fail? And so I had to defend. It's just a matter of time. It might be 100 years. I don't know. It might be like the Wonder Bread say. Maybe it will be a long time before somebody sells the Indians on getting their news from their mobile phones and so forth. I don't think it'll be that long. I think they're not that far behind America. I think within they might be 10 years behind America in people's dependence on a mobile phone and another digital devices for getting their news and information. But they're not that far. And so I had to explain that to the student that, it was a good question. It's a good challenge, but it's going to happen. It'll happen every place. It's just a matter of time because it makes too much sense. People, and the truth is, in Asia, they found that much of Asia actually depends on their mobile device more than Americans do. Americans have a mobile device, but almost all American students also have a laptop. And so when they choose between the two, most American students use their laptop more for their news and stuff than they do their mobile phones. Not that they don't have them, not that they don't like them, but they just have the habit of using their laptop instead of their mobile phones. And part of that is when you start looking at statistically, there are a lot of people in Asia that can't afford a laptop. And so they go with their mobile phone, and there's whole areas that will never have a wired connection ever. They're skipping a generation of technology, such as, again, actually Kazakhstan is an interesting case study again. When I got to Kazakhstan in 2008, the penetration rate of the internet in Kazakhstan was something like 20%, and a good share of that was dial-up still in 2008. Now they actually have a higher percentage of people accessing broadband in Kazakhstan than in America, because America has so many immigrants. A lot of the immigrants don't have broadband yet. And so they actually, it's minimal. It's like less than 1% difference. But Kazakhstan has taken off, and in about 10 years, they caught up with America in digital. So if they're catching up in the technology, they're going to catch up in the use of the technology, right? It's just going to happen. And so it's interesting to watch how these things happen. As I mentioned, Christensen is considered the most influential, or was. I think he still is. I don't think anybody's really replaced him. Again, it's kind of like Michael Jordan, even though he won lots of MVPs in the National Basketball Association, and most of the people in the world saw him as the greatest basketball player during his period of like 10 years. Nonetheless, they didn't vote for him for MVP all the time because they kind of got bored. This other guy had a pretty good year. Let's give it to him this year. But if you ever asked who's a better player, this other guy you gave the MVP to, or Michael Jordan, they all knew who was a better player. And now, for the last 10 years, it's been LeBron James. Everybody knew that LeBron James was the best, no matter they gave Stephen Curry the MVP a couple of times, and they gave somebody else, there's other people they've given MVPs to. But until like this last year or so, and even now, they're discussing, they had kind of written LeBron off, and now they're saying, yeah, maybe he still is the best. So he's 35 years old, and he maybe still is the best. There are times, when you start voting for stuff, in fact, even the second time they gave it to Christensen, there were some people who thought that, they should have spread it around a little more. So he's still pretty much, a lot of people think he's still the smartest guy in the room, the smartest guy in the world when it comes to business. Anyway, you can read that if you want to, but maybe that's him. So in 2011 and 2013, he was voted by the UK universities, not the American universities, the UK top universities, for being the top business mind in the world. I'm presuming it's saying I'm having some, I don't think it's mine, it's probably some of the Chinese students are having some bandwidth problem. I don't think it's me. Just some of the basic concepts is disruptive innovation describes a process by which technology enables new entrants into the market to provide goods and services that are less expensive and more accessible and eventually replace or disrupt well-established competitors. This definition is a little bit outdated. Christensen himself is always pushing for new understanding. In fact, he mentions in one of his videos, see what's the right word. I can't remember exactly, but basically has a sign in his door saying, you know, if you can find an exception to my rule, tell me. We want to improve. We want to improve the rules. We improve the theories. And so he has been improving them. And one of the things he's kind of, at first he thought it was all related to technology. He pretty much, you know, thought, now he realizes that the technology might not be that big of a part. It can be something actually old technology, but just applied in a new way. So it's not totally, in fact, you could almost say it's not the technology, except yes, it's pretty much, it frequently depends on a technology, but it could even be old technology that nobody's been using properly. So it's really the idea, the management perspective, the marketing and management, than it is a technology per se, as we'll show in some of the case studies that he's done. He's done lots of case studies. So one of the first ones he looked at, because he knew some of the people involved, I think I mentioned this the other day, was with the company Digital Equipment. This is explained on the right side of the slide here. And so, you know, during that time in the 1970s, so when I did my master's degree, I had to give my data to a student in the computer science department and pay him to put my data onto cards and run the cards through a mainframe computer to do my statistic for me. I was probably stupid because obviously this was being done for all the research, but I realized as he was doing my data that it was not consistent. In fact, the first time he ran it, I could see it was terribly wrong, and so he ran it again, and I still didn't trust it. And then the department, the dean of the department ran it. And I mentioned all this to my advisor in the communications department, and he insisted on running it again. So my data was run 4 times, and every time it came out different. And so that's why I never sought to publish it. It was actually really, really good research that could have easily been published, but I didn't know which set of data to use because the punch cards technology was not consistent. And so it was, I mean, a lot of stuff I studied then, if it weren't, let me put this, I could replicate it now and it would still be published. It would still be seen as very good research. But that was, how many years ago? That was 40 years ago when I did that. So it's 40 years old, but it's still research that would be published. But I just couldn't see myself taking it, submitting it for publication when I had 4 sets of data that didn't agree with each other. So it was just crazy. So in the late 1970s, when I was doing that, we were totally dependent for something like that on mainframe computers that cost millions of dollars. So during that same period of time, Digital Equipment Corporation came in with what they called a mini computer, and their mini computers were as big as this lectern. So it was hardly mini by today's standards. It was not a laptop. It was the size of this lectern here. That was a mini computer in comparison to a mainframe computer that would fill up a big room. And so at a cost of somewhere between $250,000 and $500,000, a lot of the functions that the mainframe computers were doing, the mini computer could do at a fraction of the cost. And so what Dr. Christensen noted was, all these people that were involved with digital equipment, they were seen as the smartest guys in the world. Their company was really taking off. But then fairly quickly, by the end of the 1980s and entering into the 1990s, suddenly PCs took off, and digital was disrupted by PCs. Now he asked himself, like I said, digital was in Boston. He was in Boston. A lot of smart people in Boston. These guys were seen as some of the smartest. And so so after their decline of Digital Equipment Corporation, everybody was calling them idiots, basically. These guys were idiots. They were some of the stupidest people in the world. Well, 5 years earlier, they were the smartest people in the world. You wonder how they got so stupid so fast. And so that's the first thing that got him thinking, how is it that a startup company can disrupt a company that is on top of the world, that everybody thinks is the smartest, is financially set, everything looks good for them, and along comes a company that actually has a much inferior product and destroys them? How can that be? And so that was the start of the disruption research and theories, was trying to figure this out. And he kind of asked that question in kind of strange terms, is I wonder when it was that they decided to destroy their own company. And obviously the answer is they never decided to do that. But all their decisions based on on the smartest brains in the computer world at the time could not figure out how to stop themselves from being destroyed by PCs. And part of that is what he's seen in all of his case studies. Is part of it is that a company that's really successful, it has a certain clientele. And so they have to ask themselves, when somebody goes into digital and says, we need to get into the PC market, well, what that means is we're going to compete with ourselves. We're selling computers now, they're selling for $500,000 with a really high profit margin. And you want us to compete with ourselves with a computer with a profit margin less than a 20% profit margin that you sell for a couple $1,000s. So does that make sense for our company to compete with ourselves to replace our $500,000 machines with a $2,000 machine that's really worse? And actually, none of our customers want this $2,000 machine. Not at this time. At this time, none of their customers wanted the $2,000 machine. They were very happy with their $500,000 machine. And so it's one of the things that we talked about before, that this idea that always listen to your customers will kill you, especially when it has anything to do with technology. If you base your decisions on what your customers think, that's the first problem you've got, because they do not know what they will want. They can't, especially in the field of technology and things that somehow relate to technology. There's no way that a consumer will know what they will want in the next 5 or 10 years. They can't know that. And so this digital age that we're in is disrupting lots and lots of industries, because companies like digital ask their customers, would you like this? And their customers say, of course not. Why would we want that? We're very happy with what we have, until they're not. And the problem is they're not competing with themselves. Therefore, it's another company that's offering them that other option for less money. That turns out, for what different businesses do, was perfectly good. A PC was fine for most database and most spreadsheet functions at that point, getting into the 90s. So that's just one of his case studies that he came into his doctoral dissertation or doctoral studies having in his mind. So over in the left, it kind of reiterates what I was just saying, putting in his words, top companies forced to ask themselves, should we make better products that we could sell for better profits to our best customers, or maybe we ought to make worse products that none of our current customers would buy, that would ruin our margins? What should we do? That's the dilemma. That's why the companies at the top are destroyed, is they can't see why they have to do it. They can't make that tough decision. Yes, we do have to get in the PC market and compete with ourselves. He mentioned someplace, and I can't remember. I don't think it's in any of the videos that we're going to watch, but maybe it is. That one of the companies that did survive, it may have come down a peg, but it's still a major company, is IBM. And what they did is they built a totally, first off, they were one of the biggest mainframe uh, uh, manufacturers in the world. So they were at the top with mainframes. So when they saw digital coming to the market with minis, they started a whole new company, just like Google is doing with their new moonshots. That's exactly what IBM did back in the 70s and 80s and 90s and so forth. When they saw the minis gaining power, they started a whole new company, had it moved it about 1,000 miles away from their headquarters, and said, "Okay, you guys are now in the mini computer business. Uh, Tell us all about it when you get there," so to speak. They put different management in. They did not allow the mainframe management to have any influence on the mini management. They had to be competitors. They had to be true competitors. And so they situated them 1,000 miles apart. They gave them their own management, and they were totally different companies, basically. And then along came the PCs. What they do? They started a new company in Florida to handle their PCs. Totally different management, 1,000 miles away. The mainframe executives and the mini computer executives had no influence over the PC executives. And so he admired that they're one of the few companies that has continued to thrive despite all the changes, because the way they handled it is they basically set up new companies to handle the new innovations and said, okay, go ahead and compete with us, whatever, do your best job to compete with us, we don't care. And so their competitive companies have proceeded. Um, so as I pointed out, then they really do the biggest companies are are always facing this sort of a dilemma of how to proceed, and many times they are making the wrong decisions. I think I already mentioned to some of you the another. I think the technology he studied for his dissertation was the hard drive, and the hard drive started with the big hard drive, and they got smaller, and they got smaller, and the companies would. I think he studied 51, some around 51 companies that were in the market making big hard drives, and they asked their customers, "Do you want to go a smaller hard drive?" And their customers said, "No, we like our big hard drives," until they didn't. And so at the end of this period of innovation, only 3 of the 51 companies survived because they listened to their customers, and they did not go with the new technology. He mentions Lucent and Nortel as 2 companies that had controlled the industry with switching equipment, and switching equipment was much better than Cisco's router. But Cisco just came into the market, and all it could not handle audio, but it was good enough for other data transfer. And so it came into the market using in the switching type of technology with other data, but not audio. And so Lucent and Nortel didn't take it very seriously. They're just down there working this market below us. They're not a big threat to us until they were, and then Cisco took control of the market. So again, it was the incumbent companies at the top of the market could not adapt, and they thought that they would adapt when the time came, and Cisco got way ahead of them then, because it was working on this technology full time. It was a full focus of their efforts, whereas Lucent and Nortel were making their money off of the switchers until again Cisco got good enough that suddenly its router could handle audio and so forth, and they took over the market. So again, bad decisions being made, not pursuing adequately the disruptive innovation. So one of the questions I asked then, do you always listen to your customers? And the answer is no, 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 no. Customers can't answer all the questions. And so make sure, there are some questions they can answer. Like, do you like our customer service? Well, that's fine. They can answer that question. They can't answer the question what they're going to like in 5 years. That they can't answer. They have no idea. Some other companies, some other case studies that he talks about. Anyway, I'm just going to read what it says here on the left side. Disruptive innovation is not about creating or marketing a better product, not initially. To the contrary, it transforms a relatively expensive and or complicated product into one that is financially and or technically more accessible to a much bigger market of non-consumers. And so that's what you're looking for. If you want to go challenge a giant, you don't start at the top. You don't start competing with them with the best products in the market, because you're going to fail, because they're going to be very protective of that top of the market. Where you can come in is at the bottom of the market with junk that's cheap and that finds new consumers. That's where you can find where you can get into the market. And so what he calls non-consumers. If you can find non-consumers, people that like to be consumers, but don't have the money, don't have the expertise, whatever it is that's keeping them out of the market. And then along comes another company, a disruptive company that provides it cheaper and easier, whatever. Because if you think about it, like the mainframe, I couldn't. Not only could I not afford a mainframe, the sort of training that was needed to run my data was not information, was not something they would teach me in the communications department. And so I had to go pay a computer science student to prepare my data and to run my data. Okay, because mainframes were complicated. And so it was not just cost prohibitive, it was also technology or knowledge prohibitive for me to get into the computer realm when it was a mainframe. And that was also true still with the Mini. So the PC was not just a price breakthrough, the PC was also a technology breakthrough, in that it suddenly became not only more affordable, but easier, something that a common person, a person without college training, could run a PC. And so it was more than just a price breakthrough on this. And that's what he sees in lots of these case studies he's done. So on the right side again, while the technology is usually involved, the disruptive products are not necessarily technical products per se. And so he has several case studies that we'll just talk about real quickly here in the lower right. In the area that is definitely technology was RCA versus Sony. After World War II, America pretty much dominated the world in manufacturing because everybody else was in chaos. Everybody else was bombed. America wasn't bombed, right? So all the companies or the countries that had really smart people had been bombed out. Japan had been bombed out. Germany had been bombed out. France had been bombed out. The UK, to a lesser degree, had still been bombed out. And so a lot of America's success after World War II was we were the last country standing. That's it. We had a big edge in everybody else because they were all destroyed. They had all their factories destroyed and stuff. So American companies took off, and that's where we really became the number one economy, was after the war, because of the impact of the war. We might have been technically the number one economy before that, but it wasn't that much difference until after the war, when there was a big difference. So anyway, the biggest company in the world, in America and in the world, for technical, for things like TVs. You can't really call them digital yet because they weren't digital yet. But anyway, products like that, TVs and radios, was a company named RCA. You probably never heard of it before because it was disrupted by Sony. Sony came into the market. At the time that Sony came into the market from Japan, RCA, all of its products had vacuum tubes. They did not have transistors yet, let alone chips and so forth that they've migrated to. But at that point, transistors were just being developed in the 1960s, and transistors were not good enough to give very good quality to a radio or to a TV. And so RCA was sitting here at the top of the world, and in comes Sony, and they come in with what we called in America the transistor radio. And the transistor radio was not much, maybe 3 times as big as my mobile phone, but not a lot bigger than my mobile phone. Terrible sound. I remember it. I had one. Terrible sound. It was a cheap product, and basically its non-consumers were teenagers. The parents didn't want to have a transistor radio because it was crummy. But the teenagers who wanted to listen to rock and roll music, they could afford a transistor radio and take it out to the park away from their complaining parents and listen to it with their friends. It was the first mobile technology in the area of radio, TV, and entertainment stuff. It wasn't very good, but as Dr. Christensen says, it was better than nothing. And so the teenagers became the big market. They were non-consumers who didn't have their own radios and didn't have their own TVs when Sony went into the market, and they made it both affordable and made it mobile. They met their demands for something they really needed to get away from their parents to listen to the rock and roll music. And so Sony came in, and again, at that time, RCA knew they had experts in that understood the market probably as well initially, or the technology of transistors just as well as Sony did at the start. But just like we were talking about before, while RCA, wanted it focused on its vacuum tube, its big, its TVs were as big as this lectern, because they had vacuum, a whole bunch of vacuum. In fact, even radios, a lot of the radios were as big as this lectern because of the vacuum tubes that they use instead of transistors or chips like we have now. And so it was basically a family would own one radio or a TV in their living room, and the whole family gathered together, which there's some good aspects to that, by the way. Family time together, listening to the radio or watching TV as that progressed in the 1950s. But then again, Sony, at the start, as I mentioned, that RCA had just as many experts in transistor technology as did Sony, maybe even more. But they didn't care about it. They looked at Sony and said, if you want to sell this cheap junk to these teenagers, what do we care? Right? That was their attitude. But that cheap junk got better. Sony focused just on transistors, so they made it better and better and better. And so by the end of the 1960s, suddenly the transistor TVs and the transistor radios were just as good as the vacuum tube TVs and radios, and much smaller, much more portable. And so guess who grabbed the market? Well, Sony did. And so we began to see the decline of RCA towards the end of the 1960s, and Sony took over the market. Obviously, they have other competitors, but that's where they knocked over the king, so to speak, was in the end of the 1960s with their transistor technology that RCA ignored. They didn't want to spend a bunch of money on transistor radio. They didn't want to do a bunch of improvements in and so forth with the technology they saw as inferior. And their current customers did not want it. So again, if they had, and maybe they did, survey their current customers, they would have gotten, no, we don't want that. Resounding, no, we would never buy a transistor radio until they did, right? And so Sony took over the market. During that same period of time, maybe a little bit earlier, but pretty much the same in the 1960s, in came Toyota into the American market. Ford and GM controlled it, and where did they come in? At the top? No, they came to the bottom with a crummy little product that was cheaper than what GM or Ford could make a profit on. Wasn't a very good product, cheap little car, subcompact. And so GM and Ford basically said, why should we compete? They tried competing at first, but they're literally losing money in their competition. And so it wasn't very long before they both kind of said to Toyota, you can have that. You can have that junk. We don't make any money. And in fact, their profit margins increased when they when they stopped trying to compete with Toyota at the bottom of the market. And he talks about that with a number of different products, that sometimes their actual profit margins for different companies in different fields went up as they killed the lower products that the startups were competing with. But however, in doing that, up came Toyota with better and better and better products, and now they're competing at all levels of products. Um, and you'll see probably the same thing with the Korean products, right? The Korean cars are getting better and better, and they're going to come in at the bottom. They came in at the bottom already, and they went lower than even Toyota was willing to go. And so people are buying the Korean products, and they're getting better and better and better, and they're competing at higher and higher in cars. And in comes the Chinese cars at the bottom of the market to compete. They have cheaper labor and so forth, and they're competing at the bottom of the market, and they'll go up and up and up. And we'll see this time after time in the economies, and partly because the companies just aren't willing to compete with them. They're saying our profit margins are better if we let you have that into the market. But the problem is the lower end of the market continues to go up. So at first it's the very, very bottom of the market, but then they come up a little bit and they still have the better prices. And so they decide, well, we'll make better profits if we don't compete at the second level. And so the big companies go up a level and their profit margins actually improve. And then Toyota, comes up another level, and the Ford and GM starts losing money at that level. Yeah, you can have that one too, and they go up another level until the startup company destroys their market altogether. More recently, we've all seen, Grab and Uber disrupt the taxi service, right? That's something we're all very familiar with. I think partly it's where I've lived, but I think I'm not sure if I ever took a taxi until Uber came along. And partly because I lived in places where I had my own car or whatever, but I just felt like, I know I do. I do remember taking a taxi one time when I first moved to Buffalo, New York, and they really ripped me off really bad. But anyway, so again, Uber not only is a cheaper price, but it's made it easier for people to get a taxi, to get a car to come get them, with its technology, use of technology on the mobile phone. So you hit a few buttons and there's your car waiting for you at a cheaper price. Here, I wouldn't even think about buying a car here. Why would I buy a car? I don't travel that much anyway. And Grab, for what I pay Grab for when I do want to go someplace, I couldn't even buy the gas for my car, let alone the car and the maintenance and everything else you need to do when you have a car. So here, I would never think about buying a car. I have one in America. It's I use that all the time there, but it's hard to find a taxi there where I live. Even you can Uber it's much easier to find an Uber than it is a taxi, let me put it that way. But most people have cars in America still. We'll see how if that will continue in the future. Airbnb, the same thing, and they're disrupting the hotel market. Okay, so I think these last two examples, Uber and Grab and Airbnb, are examples where you can certainly acknowledge that they're not really technology companies, right? They use technology in a way that people before them didn't use it. And so they came into a market with the help of technology, but Uber and Grab and Airbnb are not technology companies. They're companies who use technology to offer a cheaper service, make it more accessible, make it easier for people to access, and they found non-consumers like myself who would never think about taking a taxi, but we would think about taking a Grab because it makes more sense for us. So one of these ideas in a big company is you don't waste your resources on unprofitable product lines. You're hurting your profit margins. But what happened, you have these examples where the companies that are not willing to actually even lose money on some product lines end up being overcome altogether by the startups who were willing to come in and take their chances on new technology or whatever it is. And so you have these companies coming in and disrupting the big companies because the big companies listen to the professors and said, yeah, this doesn't make sense. We make more profit margin if we let them have that part of the market and move up, but they won't stop there. You can't get the startups to stop. Okay, we'll let you have the market, just stop. They won't do that, right? They won't cooperate. And they get good at what they do. And so what it is they do might be cheaper, might be crummy at first, very frequently is, but they make it better and better and better and better until they overtake you. And so one of the companies that called Dr. Christensen was Intel. And the owner of the company called him personally and asked him to come out. So he flew all the way out to Idaho, where Intel's at. He's in Boston, so it's like a 4-hour flight or something from Boston to Boise. And he gets there, and the guy said, I just have a few, he was expecting to give like an hour-long presentation. He paid him a bunch of money to come out to Idaho to do this. And he said, I don't have much time. Tell me about 10 minutes. I'll give you 10 minutes to tell me what your research is all about. And Christian said, I can't do that. I've got to give you a little more information than that, because you need to understand, and I don't know your industry well enough to adapt what I know to what you are facing. So you need to have, so he gave him a few more minutes than 10 minutes. But very quickly he realized, and he said, okay, I got you. Then, in other words, we have to do whatever is necessary to kill the competition. That was basically the bottom line he got out of it. If we have to lose money, whatever we have to do, we can't let a startup catch up with us. We've got to kill it. We've got to make our products cheaper. We need to get new product line, whatever we have to do. We can't let the startup have a foothold in our industry. That's basically his conclusion after the 20-minute version or whatever of Covey's theories. So ignore the low quality products. No, you can't do that. If those low quality products have come in and found new consumers, and your competition is making money, you've got to go in there. Even at a loss, you've got to go in there and fight them if you're a corporation. So it's actually going to make it harder for disruptive innovation, disruptive innovators, because the big boys have been reading Christensen. They know so that's, again, you see this in Google. Again, they're doing basically the IBM thing. They built a new company that was over Google. So Google used to be the top of the company. Now they created Alphabet to be on top of Google, and Alphabet is just kind of an overall, it's kind of an investment corporation, and they build subsidiaries to work on AI and on driverless cars and whatever other moonshots they want to take. They're starting new companies to do that underneath Alphabet, not underneath Google, actually. Although that's what the news stories might say, it's underneath Google. It's not really. In most cases, it's underneath Alphabet, and it's parallel to Google. Next week, you're going to be listening to Guy Kawasaki, who worked with Apple with Steve Jobs, and he's think of when you do. I'm not going to. I just put this slide in here, actually, for the Indian students. Suggested they would want to watch this, because he also has some insights that kind of parallel Christensen, but he says it in a different way. He's actually a better speaker than Christensen, and more entertaining speaker. But he kind of sees some of the same things that he went through in helping build Apple. And another one, I think 2 videos you'll watch next week. And I gave a summary here, but I'll put it in next week's PowerPoint too. I'm not going to spend time with that. We've already talked about the milkshake story, about how Christensen was brought in to study why McDonald's couldn't sell more milkshakes. And again, that's one of the questions he always asked. He was also hired by the newspaper industry, by the way, and he basically told them what he has told others that he's done consulting work with, is if you want some more income, if you want to improve your company, look for the non-consumers. And the other way of looking at that, the way he phrased it with McDonald's, was look for the job not done, or what job, think about what job is being done. In this case, what job was being done by the milkshake. So he did the consulting work based on that question. What job was the milkshake doing? And once he figured out the job it was doing, one of the things I didn't mention when I talked about last time was who were the competitors to the milkshake, to the McDonald's milkshake, when he did that study. Hopefully, I think you probably remember the discussion of that. But who were the competitors? Were there competitors besides Burger King? What were the other competitors? What were the other things that people were hiring to do the job? Donuts, bagels, Snicker bars, bananas. So in a very real sense, the competitors to the McDonald's milkshake was not other milkshakes. And so when you start considering the market they were really looking at, they were looking at lots of things that could be hired to compete with their milkshake. All those other things, the Snicker bars, the donuts, everything else were competitors to their milkshake. It was what people were hiring while they were driving on their commute to their job, or during their job, as they were sales or doing sales or whatever reason they're in their car for long periods of time. The McDonald's milkshake to them was the best thing to do the job they were asking it to do. But they were competing against all these other people, not other milkshakes. They were competing against the donuts and the Snicker bars and the bananas and so forth. And so when you understand the job being done, now you know who the competitors are, and you can make up a marketing plan to compete with those competitors. If all you think is that your only competitor is Burger King, then you failed right from the start, because you're not considering everybody or all the things that are being hired to do the job. So in order to properly put together a good marketing plan and increase your milkshake sales, you have to understand the competition and understand the job that's being done for those particular customers. So that was that idea of looking for understanding what job a product does or a service does for somebody is important. The idea of looking, if you're going to start a new business, when I teach my journalism classes, for example, two books came out of the research that they did with Christensen's guidance, because all of them, once they understood the key question that all the newspapers in America were asking themselves in order to survive, which most of them are not going to survive. They didn't really do a good job of following his research, but they made a good effort, and they created some products that did jobs that were not then being done. So they were looking for new consumers, and so they created magazines that were like a magazine for moms that were trying to, looking for good ideas for how to raise their children, especially stay-at-home moms, for example. And they looked at products in areas where they could increase tourism. So they produced tourism magazines, stuff like that. So they started asking themselves with Christensen's support, what jobs need to be done that not now being done that will help you in, maybe create a new product and bring in new revenue to help you survive this transition into the digital age that where the advertising are all going, just started abandoning them. So I may have mentioned that basically since 2005, the newspapers in America have lost more than 2/3 of their advertising revenue, more than 2/3 of it. And so a lot of them, my former company, the one that I worked for in a daily newspaper for 6 years, McClatchy, just filed for bankruptcy in the last month or so. I was laughing before that because like 2 years ago, when I was writing a chapter for a book, I looked at their financial report at that time for that year. Every year, a corporation in America has to file a financial report. And so I was looking at their financial report, and they were saying, wow, we're doing so much better. We only lost $30 million this year, and our digital products are getting better. And so I kind of laughed at them, and my book chapter was there. Yeah, if you can try to sell your stockholders on the idea that you're really happy about losing $30 million, you're doing a pretty good sales job. But now they just filed bankruptcy. So obviously, $30 million here and $30 million there, and pretty soon it's real money. So Peter Drucker, we, yeah, Covey has quoted Peter Drucker, but so does Christensen. What you're selling is not necessarily what they're buying. And so that's that concept from Peter Drucker, again, one of the early researchers and gurus of business management. It also made its way from Covey on into Christensen. He had some pretty forward thinking ideas even back in the 1930s, where you need to understand why, what people are buying. And what like it says here, what they're buying is not necessarily what you think you're selling. So you need to understand what they're buying, and then you can understand how to adapt your product. Until then, if all you're looking at are the characteristics of your product, like doing the taste test of the milkshakes, you're missing the point. Is that they didn't know what they were selling. I mean, they were selling a milkshake. So how do you make your milkshake better? But that didn't change anything until they knew what people were buying, and they weren't buying a milkshake. They're buying, yes, literally they were buying a milkshake, but primarily they're buying something to kind of distract themselves as they were driving for 30 to 60, or however long they were driving their car without, needing something to do. Dr. Christensen, as I mentioned, he thinks that finance professors are teaching a false religion, is what he says. So he kind of compares it to, that finance, these stone tablets on the right are meant to represent the 10 Commandments of Christianity, or the Judeo-Christianity. Moses basically supposedly brought down the 10 Commandments from the mountaintop, where the Lord basically etched the 10 Commandments into these rock tablets. And so he thinks that finance professors teach, basically they treat some of the things that they teach as gospel, as truth, when they're not truth. For example, the internal rate of return is one of those areas where they're destroying businesses. And so let me just go ahead. This is a chart from him. I can see I can raise this up there. Basically, there's three types of innovations that he talks about. You need to go up just a little bit at the top of this. Sometimes he talks about four. The fourth one being potential disruptive products, innovations. But the three main ones are, first off, the disruptive innovation. Always struggle to attract capital and managerial attention, especially of companies that are already doing well. They're not likely to want to invest a lot into disruptive innovation because it's risky, and there's no guarantee it's going to do well. And if it does well, it may take 5 to 10 years. And so they will focus on other types of innovation. One of the other types of innovation is what they call sustaining innovation. And so these companies like the digital company that he first was interested in, they were just doing the mini computers. And so their emphasis was how to make our mini computer better. They were not going into the disruptive technology of PCs. They were ignoring that disruptive technology, focusing on making their mini computers better and better and better, so they could charge a little more, make a little more profit off their mini computers. Another area that Dr. Christian thinks that during the Obama administration in America that most companies were doing was, the third one is called efficiency innovation. Efficiency innovation is the one that is the safest innovation of all, which is by the formulas created by the finance professors, is the one you should make, but it's also the one that will destroy your company. The the efficiency innovation is almost guaranteed to make a profit. But in the process, by the way, it also worsens a recession. Efficiency innovation, almost by definition, will end up laying off employees because you're trying to figure out how to cut your costs, and one of the best places to cut costs is with employees. So you may make some things, that's where you might go to robotics or AI or something, find some way to cut down on your use of human beings because they cost too much money. And so efficiency innovation, almost by definition, decreases the job market. And yet during that era, after the Great Recession, most companies, not just in America, but that's what I pay attention to and why I think you saw this big change under Trump. But most companies were spending their money, if they were going to invest in anything, certainly into sustaining innovation to make theirs a little better and a little better, yes, but also into this efficiency innovation, which led to more unemployment, not less, because that's what design is, designed to increase your profits and lower your expenses by definition. And so that's where the companies, the corporations were focused on sustaining innovation, make their products, keep making them better, yes, and saving money, figuring out how to become more efficient. And that's what everybody was doing after the recession. They just did not trust that it was a good time to invest into disruptive innovation. And so you saw very little disruptive innovation. And if my theory is true, my theory is, and I already told you part of it, but what I'm also thinking is that not only did suddenly employment increase, but that is a corollary sign that the companies were investing into disruptive innovation. That's what took off in American economy, was they just took their money out of those negative yield bonds, put them into investments that would help build companies, in other words, disruptive innovation. And in doing that, and probably I didn't really analyze the tax code that they started, the Democrats go crazy about them giving tax cuts to corporations. But if the tax cuts were based on their investment into disruptive innovation, that's exactly what the government should do. Give them a tax break if they would put that money into disruptive innovation. If I'm right about what happened, then according to Christensen, I should be able to predict that the next recession, other than for the coronavirus, but beyond the coronavirus, that the economy should keep growing. Contrary to what the Democrats were saying a year ago, it's about to collapse, it won't, because it takes 5 to 10 years, according to Christensen, for disruptive technology to really become profitable. And so if that money was coming out of those negative yield bonds and going into disruptive innovation, we haven't gotten to 5th year yet. We're going into the 4th year. And so we should actually see that if that's what actually happened, if I'm right with my theory, then we should actually see the economy, at least in America, actually take off in Trump's 5th year, presuming he gets reelected, because that money was going out of efficiency innovation into disruptive innovation. We'll see. And of course, there is no guarantee that those investments will be profitable, but obviously some people think they were. I think that's one reason probably why Google won the race, so to speak, in the short run anyway, in achieving quantum computing, is that they took that money out, they got that money, they invested that money, and it took about that long from the time that Trump came in. They invested a bunch of money into quantum, and they got there before anybody else got there. Now what they'll do, they're talking about other plans like giving everybody access to their quantum computer by online. Basically, you go to the cloud, you tap into their quantum computer, and you pay a service fee to them for using their quantum computer and running your stuff and getting it done instantly, 1,000 times faster than with the other computers. Anyway, so the 4th one I mentioned is then the potential disruptive innovation. Is that sometimes he refers to 4 types of innovation. So you have the disruptive innovation, you have the sustaining innovation, and you have the efficiency innovation, but sometimes he mentions the 4th one, which is potential disruptive innovation that maybe never gets there. Okay, so it doesn't become disruptive because it doesn't succeed. So it's kind of the failed in a way, or you're investing in the potential, you don't know if it's going to get there or when it's going to get there. One of the things he says, and what's this emblem in the middle right next to the capitalist dilemma, where you see the arrow going up and the arrow going kind of sideways, that blue arrow represents inefficiency innovation, or sustaining innovation, excuse me. That sustaining innovation in everything he's looked at seems to go faster than the market actually demands. And so with the computers, for example, with the PCs, when it came in, the PC where the blue line was not as good as what consumers wanted. When the PCs first came in, I bought one of the first PCs. You had to wait when you were just typing a letter. You had to wait for it to catch up with you. It was not fast enough to keep up with just normal typing. And so at first, the quality on the blue line is below the needs of the consumer, which is the dotted or the dashed red line. But what happens is the sustaining, just the competition and everything drives the sustaining innovation up to where it doesn't take too long before the product becomes better than what the normal consumer needs. And certainly that happened with the PC. The PC is way more powerful than what most of us use it for. It has a lot more capability than what the typical consumer needs. And then he sees that in time after time, that with the very nature of sustaining innovation, improves it to the point where it's beyond what the normal consumer needs, which is important in understanding then that the disruptive innovation starts with that blue line. The disruptive innovation starts below what a lot of people may need. And so you have to find a new market. You have to find non-consumers to want your crappy product. And so that's why you have to be cheaper, and you have to find those non-consumers that couldn't afford a better PC, but they can afford yours, for example. And so they come into the market, and it's good enough for them, but it's not good enough for the average consumer. But then it gets better and better and better, like the Sony, transistor products and so forth. That's the nature of it. And so that's important to understand also. So this would mention some of the stuff I've already said. I think that under disruptive innovation, it equals capital. It needs capital. And he was arguing, Christensen was arguing in 2016 that capital was so cheap. It was actually really stupid of companies not using capital and going for disruptive innovation, because the capital was so cheap. It was there's almost they were giving you capital practically for very little cost. You were able to borrow money and to go after disruptive innovation. He said, when capital is cheap, you should be taking it. Take it, and build and go for disruptive innovation. But they weren't. They were afraid to spend any money on disruptive innovation under Obama. Secondly, it does create jobs because it creates a whole new product line, creates a whole new industry. And so you see that it's building the economy. That's how you build an economy, is with disruptive innovation. The other innovation does not build your economy. And it creates corporate and economic growth, which the other ones are just kind of sustaining, or like I said, in the case of efficiency, is actually you're firing people and stuff. It's not good for it's necessary. It's part of capitalism, obviously, the free market, but it means if everybody's emphasizing efficiency innovation, it's not good for your job market. It's destroying jobs in the process. So you always need, for a healthy economy, you need all of this going on. You need disruptive innovation. You need the sustaining innovation. You need the efficiency innovation. But again, why he hates finance professors is that they will tell you your best investment is the efficiency innovation. That's the safest way of making sure you get a profit from your investment. But all the companies were putting their money into efficiency, and nobody was putting their money into disruptive innovation at that time. We're also seeing here in the competition all sorts of companies. This is just in my industry and communications. What happened to New York Times or to McClatchy, my old company, is that you at first a newspaper had all these other products. It was the place you would go if you wanted to buy or sell stuff. They had classified ads. The classified ads was one of the most read sections of the newspaper, and yet you had to pay to put your ad in there. But it's just not very much. You might pay $15 to put your ad in there to sell your car into the classified section. So it might be in there for a week or something for $15 or something. So thousands of consumers were selling stuff in the classified section of the newspaper. But then along came some online, what's it called in America? Craigslist. Craigslist came in and offered only their online service and decimated the classified sections of all the newspapers because they were letting you put your classified sections online for nothing. Didn't charge you anything for it. And so why would you pay the New York Times or somebody to put your ad in their printed paper when now everybody was going to Craigslist? I go to Craigslist all the time when I'm in America, when I'm looking for something. We moved there, we bought a new house, we needed a washing machine. We're going to go to the newspaper? No, there's actually a much better option. Now they've so decimated that they've so stolen that market away from the newspapers that the obvious place to go is Craigslist to buy a used washing machine that's still pretty good job. It does pretty good shape, pay a fraction of what a new one would cost, and you go get it and install the thing. All the classified sections, the newspapers have very, very small classified sections now because Craigslist. Same with all these other things. When buying and selling a car, used to all go through the newspaper, not anymore. Finding a job, used to always go through the newspaper, not anymore. All this sort of stuff moved away, and so in the classified section is being decimated by Craigslist. The Autotrader.com is taking away their selling cars and stuff, although you can find that also in Craigslist. Finding a job, you go to Monster.com. Trying to buy or sell a house, there's lots of different sites, but Realtor.com is one of them. So there's no need to pay to have them sell your house. You can go other free or cheaper online sites. Obviously, you don't need newspaper anymore for entertainment, not just TV, but now TV is being disrupted by Netflix and Hulu, and lots of other people are coming into the market. One of my last chapters is saying basically TV is dead. Not yet. TV is going to be dead soon because of the competition coming into the internet. TV will not survive the next 10 years probably, because maybe a little longer. And in some countries they'll last longer, especially the government supporting it. For example, it will last longer. It may last a long time in China. If the government says they want a TV, they will have TV, right? But in a free market, in a totally free market, it will disappear. In America, TV, maybe 10 years, maybe less, because everybody's now heading to the internet. There's some things you can't get on the internet very well anymore yet, some of the sports and stuff. So a lot of people are hanging on to TV or cable, different type of TV because of sports. That won't last more than 10 years. Anyway, all these sorts of things. So the newspapers used to have a monopoly on this. Then all these online services and other sorts of services came in and has just decimated them. That's why they are just a shell of themselves, and why the newspapers are dying now, and TVs are going to go right behind them because everything's going to go to the internet. Okay, I said we're going to watch some video, and I'm sorry it took more time than I thought, but so I'm going to stop the sharing. And we're going to go watch a little bit of those videos anyway. So those in China, you should probably watch the video on your own computers. That's all the Bilibili versions of it are on Moodle that you can click into those links. I'm going to stop and we're going to watch a video or two. I may have a few comments in between.
The Innovative Dilemma by Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen. The book explains how successful companies in industries fail